There are stories that bark, others that bite. But once in a rare while, there's one that simply lays its head down beside a grave and waits. What would make a German shepherd vanish into the forest for 5 years, only to return one morning, silently, to the resting place of his fallen handler? And more haunting, why did no one ever search for him? This is not a tale of noise or medals. It's about scars no one sees, and loyalty no time can erase. Stay with us until the final frame, even if you're the hardest heart to move. And tell us, in the comments below, if someone waited 5 years just to be near you again, would you know what to say? He was supposed to have died that night, but here he was again, curled at the grave of the man who never left him. The fog in Iron Hollow moved like breath from a sleeping beast, low and damp and slow to rise. It blanketed the town's hilltop cemetery in silence, curling around the wrought iron fence and slipping between the crooked headstones, as though afraid to disturb the dead. The pines surrounding the hill stood like tired sentries, their trunks disappearing into the dense gray, their needles still with last night's rain. And somewhere in that mist, beneath the skeletal branches of an old maple, a man moved alone. Caleb Ward walked with the weight of quiet rituals. He didn't hurry. His boots, black with dry mud, pressed into the softened ground without urgency. In one hand, he carried a small bundle of wildflowers. Nothing fancy, just a mix of what he'd gathered near the creek on his morning patrol. In the other, he held his hat, fingers brushing the brim absently, as if unsure whether he deserved to wear it at all. He had come, as he did each month, to visit the grave of Officer James Ellery. Not because it was expected. No one in town asked, and most had long stopped talking about the man who never came back from the Payette Woods. But Caleb remembered. He remembered James's steady voice on the radio, the quiet way he folded maps like scripture, and the German shepherd always pacing at his heel, alert, loyal, unflinching. Barren. Caleb crested the small rise where James was buried. The headstone was simple, gray granite, slightly weathered. No badge etched into the surface, just his name, rank, and the dates that bookended a short but honest life. Beneath it, the ground sloped gently, giving way to a patch of wild moss and rain-softened earth. Caleb slowed as he reached it, and then he stopped. His breath caught, his fingers slackened, and the flowers slipped from his hand, falling soundlessly to the dirt. There, curled against the base of the headstone like a memory too stubborn to die, was a dog. Not just any dog, a German shepherd. His coat, once surely thick and gleaming, was now patchy and streaked with silver. Mud clung to his flanks, dried in dark ridges along his spine. One ear drooped at a sharp angle, and his legs were drawn tight beneath him, as though conserving warmth he could no longer hold. He didn't lift his head. He only looked up with amber eyes, tired, hollowed, and impossibly familiar. The fog hung around them both, pressing inward like the closing of a book. Caleb's voice didn't come. It didn't need to. His chest ached with the shock of recognition, and not the kind that came with simple memory. This was deeper, primal, like finding a photograph you'd buried years ago and realizing it still knew your face. The dog blinked, slow and deliberate. His eyes moved from Caleb to the stone beside him, then back again. Barren. It wasn't possible. The report had been clear, presumed dead in the chaos of the raid. No body found, but heavy gunfire, a partial building collapse, and the fire afterward made certainty inevitable. No one questioned it. No one asked. And yet here he was, flesh and bone and mud, pressed to the cold earth like a sentinel left behind. Baron didn't growl, didn't whimper. He didn't even move beyond a faint twitch of his whiskers. But his eyes, they stayed fixed, not on the man before him, but on the name carved into the stone. Caleb lowered himself slowly, knees pressing into the damp ground. He didn't reach out. Not yet. This wasn't a moment for touch. This was something else, something sacred. The air smelled of wet leaves and iron. Somewhere a crow called once, sharp and distant. Baron shifted slightly. His body trembled, almost imperceptibly, and he leaned forward just enough to press his nose against the stone. His muzzle lingered there, breath fogging gently against the granite. Then, with a trembling tongue, he licked the face of the stone, once, softly. Caleb's chest tightened. He shrugged off his jacket, careful not to startle the dog, and laid it beside the headstone. The ground beneath was cold and damp, but he didn't care. He sat cross-legged, close enough to feel the quiet heat from Baron's body, not close enough to intrude. Neither of them spoke. The fog thickened for a while, then began to lift, just slightly. The trees stood clearer now, their trunks etched like old scars against the sky. The cemetery remained empty. Baron gave a soft exhale, almost a sigh, and his head dropped back to his paws. Caleb looked at the scar running down the dog's front leg. Old, twisted. He hadn't just survived. He had endured something that didn't end in the woods that night. Still no movement, no sound, just the breath between them and the weight of what was left unsaid. Caleb finally looked away from the stone, glancing across the quiet graves, the shifting mist. He didn't know where the dog had been, didn't know who had kept him alive, or what had tried to end him. But he knew one thing with a clarity that went deeper than memory. Baron had come home, not to a house, not to a name, but to the last place where love had spoken his name aloud. And that was enough, for now. Caleb didn't know how long he sat there beside the grave. The fog began to thin around mid-morning, burning off slowly under a pale sun that never quite broke through. Moisture clung to his sleeves, and a steady chill settled into his knees where they touched the ground. But he didn't move, not until the German shepherd did. The dog stirred slightly, not alarmed, not afraid, just aware. His ears didn't stand fully, but the muscles behind them flexed, and his gaze, those worn amber eyes, shifted once more toward Caleb. It wasn't recognition in the way most people expected. There was no leaping joy, no bark of welcome. It was something quieter, something older. As if the dog was not seeing Caleb the man, but measuring his scent, his presence, his right to be this close to the grave. Caleb met the gaze without reaching out. He simply nodded, barely perceptible, and sat back on his heels. The silence stretched between them like the space between two shores, separate but tethered by a river of shared memory. And then, Baron moved. He lifted his head, slow, stiff, and turned to face the gravestone fully. One paw stretched forward, tentative, uncertain. He pressed it gently to the flat face of the granite, resting it there like a gesture of reverence, or grief, or something that didn't need a name. Then, slowly, he leaned his head in and placed it against the same spot, muzzle pressed flat, breathing shallow. A low sound left his throat. Not a whine, not a growl, just breath, heavy with something that hadn't yet left him. Caleb swallowed hard. Something in him shifted, not all at once, but enough to crack the surface of the silence he'd carried too long. 5 years ago, James Ellery had walked into the woods with Baron and never walked back. Caleb had been stationed on the other side of the ridge that night. Too far, too late. When the call came through, it was all static and confusion. Gunfire, a half-collapsed cabin, shouting, then silence. The cleanup had found Ellery's body, broken beneath a falling beam. Barron's collar had turned up nearby, torn, bloodied, but no trace of the dog himself. They had assumed the worst. Now Caleb wasn't so sure that had ever been the right thing to do. Barron dropped his paw and stepped back from the headstone. His movement was slow, deliberate. Old pain made his left hind leg tremble as he stood. Caleb instinctively reached out a hand, not to grab, not to command, just open, palm turned upward. Barron hesitated. His body tensed, head low, eyes locked on the hand. His ears drew back, and for a moment Caleb thought he might retreat. Then Barron's nose twitched, and he leaned forward. Not much, just enough to brush the edge of Caleb's fingers with the tip of his nose. His breath was warm, laced with damp earth and something older. Fear, perhaps. Memory. The faint echo of chains. Caleb didn't speak. He let his hand stay where it was, unmoving. Barron lingered for a second longer before he stepped around the hand and came to stand beside Caleb. Not touching, just close, as if proximity was permission enough. Caleb watched the dog's side rise and fall with each breath. His ribs were visible beneath the matted coat. The fur along his spine was dirty and thinning. The line of his tail sagged. He had the look of a dog that had learned to flinch before he barked. "You've been through hell," Caleb whispered, more to himself than to the dog. Barron didn't respond. He simply turned his head toward the grave again, then back to Caleb, and finally down the hill. It was time. Caleb stood, slow so as not to startle. His knees cracked under him. The flowers he had dropped earlier now lay trampled beneath the wet earth, petals bruised and folded. He didn't pick them back up. He stepped toward his patrol car, parked just beyond the cemetery gate where the road dipped back toward Iron Hollow's center. The engine was cold, the windshield beaded with mist. Caleb opened the back door and turned. Barron hadn't moved. He stood at the top of the hill, facing the grave. The wind shifted then, pushing back the last of the fog. It caught the dog's fur, lifting strands of it in a soft current. Caleb thought for a moment that Barron wouldn't come, that perhaps he'd return to the woods, that maybe he hadn't come back at all, not really, just a ghost passing through. But then Barron turned. His steps were slow, uneven, but deliberate. He crossed the grass with the same silent grace Caleb remembered from long ago, when James used to work patrol with him, when Barron's form moved like a shadow through the night, responding only to voice commands and the soft press of James's hand. Now he walked to Caleb, not hurried, not fearful, just forward. Caleb opened the door wider. Barron hesitated, sniffed the threshold, then with a soft grunt climbed in. He didn't lie down immediately. He circled once, twice, then with a tired groan, he curled against the seat, muzzle resting on the edge, eyes half-lidded. Caleb shut the door gently. He rounded to the driver's side and slid behind the wheel. The keys turned. The engine hummed. In the rearview mirror, Barron's eyes met his. Not questioning, not grateful, just present. And for the first time in 5 years, Caleb didn't feel alone in the silence. The patrol car wound its way down the 2-lane road that hugged the edge of Iron Hollow, tires humming over old asphalt slick with drizzle. Pines pressed close on either side, towering and dark, their trunks streaked with moss. The town was just waking, windows glowing softly in weather-worn houses, smoke rising from chimneys like ghostly threads. But Caleb didn't look toward the homes or the sidewalks or the morning routines. His eyes flicked only between the road ahead and the rearview mirror, where the shape of Barron lay hunched in the back seat, silent and still. The dog hadn't moved much since climbing in. He'd curled into himself, head tucked low, breath fogging faint against the glass. Once or twice Caleb heard a low grunt, like an old man adjusting sore joints. Once a shiver passed through the German shepherd's frame, sharp, involuntary. Caleb turned the heat up. The radio crackled with morning dispatch chatter, voices distant and clinical. Caleb reached for the dial and turned it off. The silence returned. The forest thinned as they neared the edge of town. Old barns leaned into the wind like drunks at last call. A single deer stood motionless in a field of frost-laced grass, watching them pass with wide, unreadable eyes. Caleb drove slower than usual. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the weight of the dog in the back seat. Maybe it was something else. The feeling that by driving too fast, he'd shatter whatever fragile spell had allowed this impossible reunion. He turned off the main road and followed the gravel path toward his cabin. It sat at the far end of an old logging trail, just past a wooden bridge that moaned under the tires when crossed. The place wasn't much, just a one-story home framed by pine, the paint peeling in places, the porch steps uneven, but it was quiet, and the woods around it listened more than they spoke. Caleb parked under the old carport, cut the engine, and turned in his seat. Barron had lifted his head. His eyes didn't meet Caleb's. They scanned the perimeter of the cabin, nose twitching, ears slightly back. His body was alert but not panicked. The tail didn't wag, but it didn't press flat either. Caleb opened the door. "You coming?" he said softly, not expecting an answer. He stepped out, leaving the back door open. The wind brushed against him, cool and damp. A raven called in the distance. Inside the car, Barron didn't move. Then, after a few heartbeats, the dog shifted forward. His paws touched the edge of the seat. He stepped down, slow, back legs trembling slightly. His claws clicked against the gravel, and when he stood beside Caleb, he paused to scan the yard again, eyes alert. Caleb opened the front door. Warmth greeted them. The smell of wood smoke, cedar, and something faintly metallic. Gun oil, maybe. The stove in the corner still glowed from the embers he'd banked the night before. A thick wool blanket lay rumpled on the armchair beside it. The room was dim, lived in. Caleb hadn't cleaned much lately. A pair of boots rested by the fireplace. A coffee cup, ring-stained and chipped, sat on the table beside a worn photograph of James Ellery in uniform, smiling, wind in his hair. Barron stepped over the threshold and stopped. His head lifted. He sniffed the air once, then again. Slowly he padded forward. Not aimless, deliberate. He moved to the stove, circled once, then lowered himself to the braided rug in front of it and curled tight. Tight enough that his ribs rose against the skin. He let out a breath that rattled, then went still. Caleb watched for a long moment. Then he crouched nearby, not too close. From this angle, in the low light, the full damage was clearer. The dog's coat was worn thin along his spine and hips. One patch near the shoulder was missing entirely, exposing mottled skin and scar tissue. A faint line of old chain burn marked his neck, a raw collar rubbed too long and too tight. Caleb saw calluses on the pads of the paws, an unnatural stiffness in the left rear leg, as if it had once healed wrong, or never healed at all. He reached slowly, resting his hand inches away from the dog's side. Barron's body tensed, But he didn't pull away. Caleb didn't touch him, not yet. Just left the hand there, offering presence. A single blink from the dog. Then stillness. Later, Caleb stood and moved to the kitchen. The fridge held little, some leftover stew, a few eggs, coffee grounds hardened in their tin. He cracked an egg into a small bowl, added a splash of warm broth, stirred it gently, and set it near the stove. Barron didn't touch it at first. Then his nose twitched. He rose, stiff and slow, limped forward, and began to eat. Silent, cautious, methodical. He didn't lift his head until the bowl was empty. Caleb sat in the armchair with the blanket across his knees, watching the fire. Barron lay beside him now, eyes open but glazed, breathing steady. Outside, the trees shifted under a soft wind, and the clouds hung low over Iron Hollow like the breath of the past refusing to leave. The dog did not sleep. Not yet. Instead, he stared into the flames, as if searching them for answers no one had given him. And Caleb, though he didn't say it aloud, began to understand that not all wounds leave blood. Some just change the way you walk, or breathe, or trust, and some, like the dog beside him, never really close at all. Morning in Iron Hollow began slowly. The fog had lifted, but the sky stayed low, a canvas of pale gray stretching over the rooftops and pines. From the window above his small kitchen sink, Caleb could see frost still clinging to the tops of fence posts, the garden soil hardened in uneven ridges. The world outside hadn't changed, but the inside of the cabin felt different now, weighted, as if the quiet had deepened with the presence of another life. Barron hadn't slept much during the night. He would doze in short bursts, but every creak of the old wooden floor, every gust of wind against the eaves would pull him awake again. More than once, Caleb had heard the dog panting softly, not from exertion, but from dreams, the kind that never seemed to end. He didn't whimper, didn't cry, just lay there, eyes wide and alert in the dark, like he was still waiting for something to hurt. Caleb didn't sleep either. He'd stayed in the armchair, blanket pulled up to his chest, the fire reduced to embers. His eyes drifted from the stove's glow to the dog's ragged silhouette and back again. Around 2 a.m, Barron had finally shifted, slowly crawling toward the hearth, until his body was flush against the warm stone base. That was where he still lay now, head resting on his outstretched paws, eyes half closed, ears occasionally twitching. There were things Caleb needed to do. Calls to return, patrol routes to check, paperwork sitting neglected in the back office of the Iron Hollow Sheriff's Station. But he didn't move toward any of them. Instead, he crossed the room to a narrow bookshelf near the desk and pulled down an old manila folder, thick with time. He laid it flat on the table. The paper inside was warped at the corners, some pages slightly yellowed, others smudged with graphite where notes had been added hastily. The file had been closed within a month of James's death. No suspects apprehended. The structure had collapsed due to fire, possibly caused by propane tanks inside. Drug activity suspected, but never confirmed. Barron had been listed as MIA, presumed dead. Caleb flipped through the pages slowly. There were printed photographs, blurry and underexposed, shots from a crime scene technician who had arrived too late to catch more than ruin. The collapsed roof, scorched trees, ashes where there had once been walls. In one image, barely distinguishable, a dog collar, ripped and dark with soot. No body, just the assumption. He looked toward Barron, who now slept lightly, sides rising and falling with a steadier rhythm than the night before. Caleb's eyes drifted back to the folder. He reached into the side drawer of the desk and pulled out a small scanner, worn, plastic chipped, but still functional. Every officer in the county carried one, used for checking microchip IDs on strays or suspected stolen animals. He crouched beside the sleeping shepherd, resting a hand on the floor to brace his weight. "It's all right," he murmured, though Barron had yet to stir. Carefully, he raised the scanner, passing it over the base of the dog's neck. A faint beep. The screen flickered to life, but the result wasn't what it should have been. The display showed fragments, numbers without context, a partial registration code, no owner information, no attached file. It was as if someone had wiped the record clean, not just erased it, but dismantled it deliberately, leaving only a shell behind. Caleb frowned, brows tightening. He tried again. Same result, the same broken string of digits, no name, no agency, no trail. Barron's eyes opened slowly. He didn't move, but his gaze met Caleb's, calm, steady, as if he knew what the officer had found. Caleb sat back on his heels. Someone had erased this dog from the system, not because of a malfunction, not because of a mistake, because they wanted him gone. He stood and walked back to the desk, file still open. The report had been thin from the beginning. Sparse statements from nearby hikers who heard shots. A single account from a Forest Service ranger who saw smoke hours after the raid. James had been found first. Barron was assumed collateral. There'd been too much chaos to dig deeper. Caleb leaned against the edge of the desk, arms folded, eyes locked on the fire. What had he missed? More importantly, why had no one cared to ask? Barron stirred, rose slowly, and limped across the room to stand near the coffee table where the file lay open. He sniffed the paper once, then looked at Caleb, not with confusion, but with a kind of quiet waiting. Like he too remembered what had been lost inside those words. Caleb didn't say anything. He reached for the last page, the incident map marked with red ink to indicate key locations from the night of the raid. The dots looked meaningless now, scattered like old wounds across the tree line. He traced one with his finger, a clearing near the northern ridge, a turnoff from a service road that never got paved. It was circled faintly. James had gone in that way, and now Barron was here, 5 years later, thin, wounded, and silent, having found his way back not to Caleb, not to safety, but to the grave of the man who had died that night. He hadn't returned by accident. Caleb closed the file. Outside, the wind pressed against the cabin walls, low and constant, as if the forest had started to whisper again. And Caleb began to listen. The morning wore on with a steady hush that hung over Iron Hollow like a held breath. A light mist had begun to fall again, clinging to the evergreens and soaking into the cracked paint of old fences. Caleb drove through the narrow town roads without turning on the radio, the windshield wipers swaying in their slow rhythm. Barron lay in the back seat, eyes open but still. Every few minutes he lifted his head slightly at the sound of a truck passing or the bark of a dog behind a yard fence, but he didn't react beyond that. He was watchful in the way of something that had learned too well what to fear and how to hide it. Caleb turned off Main and followed a gravel path that led toward the edge of the creek. The houses here were older, built decades ago, back when Iron Hollow still believed in expansion. Most had long since weathered into silence. At the end of the lane stood a small white house with a rust-colored roof and a porch sagging gently in the center. Hanging baskets of dried flowers swayed in the wind. A wind chime made from old spoons clinked faintly near the door. He parked out front and killed the engine. Barron's ears perked as Caleb opened the door. For a moment, the dog stayed still in the back seat. Then he shifted forward slowly, paws hitting the floorboard with a soft thump. Caleb opened the rear door, and Barron stepped out on his own this time. No leash, no command, just movement born of quiet understanding. The woman who opened the door wore a thick cardigan the color of pine needles and glasses that magnified the pale blue of her eyes. Her hair was white and swept back into a loose bun, strands curling near her temples. She was thin, but not fragile. There was strength in the way she held the doorframe, steady, as though she had learned long ago how not to be moved easily. "Viola," Caleb said, voice low. She looked past him, her eyes settling on the shepherd. Her breath caught. "Lord," she whispered. "Is that—" Caleb gave a single nod. "Barron." Viola stepped down from the porch slowly, her fingers tightening briefly on the rail, as if to keep herself from running. She came close, but not too close, crouching a few feet away from the dog. Barron had stopped beside Caleb, his body still, head lifted, tail low but not tucked. "It's really him," she murmured. "I'd know those eyes anywhere." Barron tilted his head slightly. Viola stayed where she was, palms open, her voice barely above a whisper. "You used to sit by the fence in the summer. Remember that? James would be out polishing the truck, and you'd bark like mad at the birds. He'd scold you, but you'd just look proud of yourself." She laughed softly, the sound tinged with something heavier. "You were so particular. Never let anyone but James get near you." Barron stepped forward. Viola's breath caught again, but she didn't move. The shepherd came to a halt in front of her and looked down, sniffed her hand, then gently leaned his head into her chest. Her hands, shaking now, came up and rested lightly on either side of his neck. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered. Barron didn't move away. He stood there and let her remember. Caleb watched in silence, his jaw tight, his heart wrapped in something he couldn't quite name. There was a kind of reverence in Viola's touch, not unlike the way someone might hold a photograph worn thin from decades of handling. Her fingers slid gently up to the side of Barron's face, brushing a patch of fur still matted from the days before. "I thought you were gone," she said, almost to herself. "Just like him." Barron pulled back slightly. Viola reached into her sweater pocket and pulled out something small, a faded strip of green fabric. She turned to Caleb. "James left this with me years ago. Said if anything ever happened to him, I was to keep it until someone remembered to come for it. I suppose I never thought that someone would be a dog." The strip was a piece of cloth, frayed at the edges, a makeshift collar or maybe something used to tie equipment in the field. On it, faintly stamped, were the initials J.E. Viola knelt and looped it carefully around Barron's neck. It wasn't tight. It didn't need to be. The brass ring at the center glinted in the low light. Barron stood still the whole time, not resisting. When it was fastened, he exhaled softly and pressed his nose briefly against Viola's hand before turning and walking back to Caleb's side. Viola wiped her eyes quickly and stood. "He came back to the only place that still held James," she said. "You brought him the rest of the way." "I didn't bring him," Caleb said. "He brought himself." Viola nodded. "And now he's brought something back with him." They didn't speak for a long moment. Just stood there, two people and a scarred dog, on the edge of a porch that remembered more than it ever said aloud. Then Viola stepped closer and placed a hand gently on Caleb's arm. "You watch over him now. He's carried something heavy through these years. He's still carrying it." Caleb nodded, his throat thick. "I will." Barron looked up at him briefly, and for the first time, his tail moved, just once, a slow wag like the swing of a pendulum set in motion after years of stillness. The wind stirred again. The chimes whispered above the porch, and the three of them stood quietly, holding a space that grief had once hollowed, and something older had now begun to fill. The road back toward the forest was one Caleb hadn't taken in a long time. It veered west from Iron Hollow, past an old ranger station, and then dipped into the edge of the Payette, where the trees grew denser, taller, older. Patches of snow still clung to the shaded hollows, though spring was creeping in with the promise of thaw. The air had that clean, sharp smell of wet pine needles and damp soil. Honest smells, the kind that reminded Caleb of a world before radios and reports, and the thin walls of a patrol office. Barron sat in the passenger seat this time. It had been his choice. Caleb had opened the back door, just as before, but Barron had stood still, staring at the front. Caleb hadn't said a word. He'd just opened the other door and waited. The dog climbed in slowly, his movements stiff but deliberate, then sat without a sound. Now, as the truck rumbled along the dirt road, Barron watched the woods pass with an intensity Caleb couldn't quite describe. Not anxiety, not even alertness. It was something closer to memory. They reached the clearing where the old service trail cut off, a place marked on the incident map years ago. Caleb parked at the edge of the tree line. The engine ticked as it cooled. The wind moved through the branches above in soft pulses, almost like breath. Barron didn't wait for instruction. As soon as the door opened, he stepped out. He sniffed the air, took a few slow paces toward the trailhead, then stopped and looked back. Caleb fell in behind him. The forest enveloped them almost immediately. The sound of the truck, the distant reach of the town, even the sky itself, all of it faded beneath the green canopy. Barron moved ahead at his own pace, not fast, not slow, just steady. His paws crunched softly over pine needles and dead leaves. His ears shifted with every sound. The creak of branches, the caw of a distant bird, the crack of something unseen stepping lightly far off the trail. Caleb walked behind him in silence. This was the same path James had taken that night. The undergrowth here was thick in places, thin in others. Patches of lichen clung to rocks. Trees leaned at odd angles from years of wind and weather. At one point, Barron stopped at a small rise in the trail and turned sharply to the left, leaving the path altogether. He didn't hesitate. He moved into the brush with certainty. Caleb followed. They came to a break in the tree line, a clearing no larger than a small living room. The ground here was uneven, scarred by the faint remnants of long-ago tire tracks and shallow trenches where logs might have been dragged. Barron paused at the edge, nose working the air. Then he moved to the far corner, his body tense, and began to dig. It wasn't frantic. It wasn't playful. It was surgical. Caleb stepped forward, crouching a few feet away as dirt was pushed aside. Then something soft emerged from the soil. A strip of cloth, torn, faded, the color once olive or gray, now closer to ash. Barron picked it up gently in his mouth and laid it at Caleb's feet. The fabric was stiff with age, edges singed. Caleb turned it over slowly. A faint mark, a drop of dried blood maybe. Maybe not. And a partial patch, shredded at the edge, something military or paramilitary. Not standard issue for law enforcement. Barron sat, his tail resting beside the disturbed earth, eyes watching. He hadn't barked once, hadn't whined, just brought Caleb to this place and said everything without saying anything at all. Caleb stood and looked around. The trees here were thicker on one side. A moss-covered stump stood like a sentinel to the north. The air smelled faintly metallic. Something about this place pressed against the skin differently. Not dangerous exactly, just heavy. He could almost see it. James, moving through the dark, flashlight scanning the trees. Barron at his side. Then noise. Chaos. A sharp crack. Shouts. Something collapsing. And after that, silence. The kind that didn't just fill the air, but swallowed it. Barron turned and walked a few paces to the left. His nose hit the ground again. He pawed gently, then uncovered something else, smaller this time. A rusted buckle, and beneath it, a sliver of plastic. Caleb brushed it off, revealing part of a shattered radio casing. Police issue. 5 years. This had been here 5 years, buried just beneath the surface. Caleb slipped the buckle and the cloth into his jacket pocket. Barron was already walking back toward the trail, not eager to leave, just finished. Caleb followed without a word. They didn't speak on the drive home. Barron curled in the passenger seat, eyes half-lidded, head resting against the dashboard. Outside, the trees blurred by, fading into a soft haze of green and gray. Back at the cabin, Caleb laid the cloth and buckle on the table beside the old case file. The photograph of James, still resting beneath the coffee cup, seemed to look straight through it all. He glanced at Barron, now sleeping near the stove, body still but breathing steady. He thought of the grave, of the cloth buried in the earth, of the wiped chip, of a dog who had walked through fire, through chains, through silence to bring him here. And he understood now. Barron wasn't just remembering. He was guiding. The wind picked up that evening, rustling the tall pine trees outside Caleb's cabin like a sea of whispers just beyond reach. He set a kettle on the stovetop, the kind that sang soft and slow when it boiled. The room was dim, lit only by the fire's orange glow, flickering shadows across the wooden walls. Barron lay curled by the hearth, his breathing slow but not restful. Every few minutes, one of his paws would twitch, then stiffen. His ears flicked even when the room was still. Caleb sat nearby, watching him with the kind of quiet attention that only comes from people who've learned not to interrupt another creature's pain. Outside, the sky had darkened to that deep navy where the stars hesitate before appearing. The forest was silent, almost unnaturally so. No owls, no coyotes, just wind. And then, as the kettle began its low whistle, Barron suddenly let out a low, guttural sound. Not quite a growl, not quite a whimper. Caleb turned from the stove, just in time to see Barron's legs kick out violently in his sleep. The dog was dreaming, but not peacefully. Barron's jaws clenched, and a short bark escaped his throat, sharp and frightened. He let out a high-pitched yelp, then another, more urgent. His body twisted, paws scraping against the hardwood floor like he was running from something he couldn't escape. Caleb dropped to his knees beside him, hand reaching gently for the back of the dog's neck. "It's okay," he whispered, but the words hung empty. Barron let out another cry, this one more wounded. Then his head jerked back as if caught by something. His eyes snapped open, wild, disoriented. He scrambled upright, stumbling as his back leg gave out. His tail tucked tightly, his breathing was shallow, chest heaving. The cabin filled with a strange sound then, far off, mechanical, a sharp rhythmic hum that grew louder through the window. Chainsaw. Not from Caleb's property, somewhere in the forest. Not close, but close enough. Barron froze, every muscle in his frame locked, his head tilted slightly, and then his lips curled back. Not in aggression, but in memory. A deep, low growl rippled through his chest. Caleb stood, moved to the window, and stared into the dark woods. The sound droned on, maybe a mile away, maybe less. someone clearing dead trees, or something else. When he turned back, Baron was standing in the center of the room, staring directly at the door, his tail rigid, his body still trembling. Caleb walked over, knelt again, and placed his hand gently behind the dog's ear. Baron flinched, then leaned into the touch like someone desperate to believe they were safe but not quite able to trust it yet. "You're not there anymore," Caleb whispered. Baron exhaled sharply through his nose, then sat, eyes still fixed on the door. Later that night, Caleb sat in the old rocking chair near the fire. Baron was lying close but not curled, just stretched out, alert but no longer shaking. His head rested on his front paws, ears relaxed, but not quite down. Caleb could feel the shift, subtle but real. It wasn't peace. Not yet, but something softer than fear. He thought of how many nights this dog must have spent waiting, tethered, listening to the same sounds echo in the trees, alone, possibly caged, possibly worse. And yet, here he was. That was what haunted Caleb the most. Not the mystery of Baron's disappearance, or even the scars. It was the silence, the years of it. Not just from Baron, but from everyone else, from the department, from the files that never got read twice, from the radio that had gone quiet the night James died. He looked over at the scarred shepherd. The firelight danced in Baron's eyes, golden and tired. Caleb didn't speak again. There wasn't anything more that needed to be said. Sometimes survival wasn't loud. It didn't cry out for help or scream in pain. Sometimes it just lay there, breathing, night after night, until something, someone, found it again. And sometimes that was enough. When Caleb woke near dawn, still in the rocker, a blanket thrown over his shoulders without memory of doing so, Baron was finally asleep. Deeply. One paw twitching in a dream that, this time, didn't look like it hurt. The chainsaw had stopped hours ago, but its echo lingered, and Caleb, without yet knowing why, began to realize they were going to follow that sound. Not to escape it, but to find the truth it buried. The morning broke pale and cold, the sky the color of weathered bone. Frost crusted the edges of the porch railing, and the pines stood quiet, statuesque against the windless dawn. Caleb rose slowly, joints stiff from the night spent in the rocking chair. He looked to the hearth. The fire had faded to glowing embers. Baron was already awake, sitting upright in the same place he had fallen asleep, gaze steady, ears drawn forward, body leaning just slightly toward the door. Not with fear, with purpose. Caleb opened the door. The morning air carried a sharpness that bit at his cheeks and lungs. Baron stepped outside without hesitation, his movements slow but certain, like he had somewhere to be, not in urgency, but with a weight long carried. Caleb grabbed his jacket and keys. No leash. Not today. They didn't take the truck. Baron wouldn't have gone if they had. He walked with his nose to the earth, following something that Caleb couldn't see, but trusted anyway. They crossed the tree line behind the cabin, followed the slope westward, passing the ridge where sunlight rarely touched. It was quiet again. Too quiet. A mile in, the trees began to thin, revealing a trail overgrown with brush and needles. Baron paused, sniffed the air, then pressed forward. Caleb followed, boots crunching softly on frosted ground, every sense alert. The air smelled of rusted metal and wet moss, and something else, faint, but wrong. The path curved left, around a cluster of blackened stumps. Then Baron stopped. Not suddenly, but with the finality of recognition. Ahead, hidden behind a curtain of thick pines and collapsed timber, stood what might have once been a hunter's cabin. Now it was barely more than a box of rotting wood and broken glass, The roof had partially caved. A shutter banged loose in the breeze. But it was what was outside that made Caleb's breath pause. A rusted chain, snapped at one end, coiled near a stake embedded in the frozen ground. A cracked dog bowl half buried in soil. Scraps of cloth, a plastic crate, door twisted off its hinges. Caleb stepped closer. The scent hit him first. Sour, metallic, moldy. Years old, but not forgotten. Flies buzzed faintly near a clump of something unidentifiable. He swallowed hard. Barron didn't growl. He didn't bark. He walked forward with the steadiness of someone who'd been here before. He paused at the base of the doorframe, sniffed, then turned left, to a corner where the cabin's siding had peeled open like torn skin. There, in the dirt, buried beneath leaves and twigs, was a cloth strip, part of a shirt, faded and stained. Barron pawed at it once, twice, then stepped back. Caleb knelt. The fabric was flannel, blue and white. His gloved fingers turned it over. Blood, long dried. Barely a trace, but unmistakable. He reached deeper and uncovered something else. A photograph, curled and weather-worn. It was James, his late partner, standing in uniform. Barron sat beside him. A clean cut across the dog's right ear matched the scar Barron still bore. Someone had circled James's face in pen. Fingers, filthy, smeared with some kind of oil or soot, had left smudges across the image. Inside the cabin, Caleb moved slowly. His flashlight cut through layers of dust and shadow. Wire cages lined the wall, most empty, their doors warped open. One still had bones inside, small, scattered, likely canine. There were bite marks on the wood. Scratches deep in the floorboards, evidence not just of neglect, but cruelty, intentional, calculated. On a makeshift table lay collars, different sizes, worn, blood-stained. Beside them, a ledger. Caleb flipped through it with gloved hands, names, dates, notes in shorthand. Responsive, too soft. Eliminated. He didn't finish the pages. He didn't have to. This wasn't a cabin. It was a camp, a training ground for something darker than policing. For dogs used and discarded, reshaped into weapons or thrown away when they didn't comply. Barron sat at the threshold the entire time, eyes fixed on the trees, watching, guarding, waiting. When Caleb emerged, he didn't speak. There was no anger in his face, only resolve, cold and still. He took the photo, the strip of fabric, and the ledger. He looked once more at the chain outside, then down at Barron. The dog met his gaze, tail low but steady. Not wagging, not afraid. Just present. They walked home in silence. At the station, Caleb said nothing to his colleagues. He didn't raise alarms. He didn't ask for backup. Instead, he documented everything quietly, methodically, took photographs, made copies, filed reports. He called no press, no headlines would come of this. But when the department returned 2 days later with cleanup crews, the cabin was torn down, the cages removed, the land marked for federal investigation. No names were released, no arrests were made, but the place no longer existed on any map. Barron never returned to that patch of forest. He didn't need to. The warning had been delivered and heard. Some silences, Caleb had learned, were not empty. They were full of truths too heavy for words, and some warnings didn't need volume. Just a dog who came back from the dead to stand where no one else would. The snowfall that morning came in soft, uneven patterns, like ash drifting down from a faraway fire no one could remember. Caleb sat in the dim light of his desk lamp at the Iron Hollow precinct, a place that always smelled faintly of burnt coffee and old pine cleaner. Barron rested by his feet, head against Caleb's boot, eyes half-lidded but watchful, always watchful now. On the desk before him, a thin folder lay open, not thick enough to tell a full story, but heavy enough to change the air in the room. He had submitted the report quietly. No speeches, no calls to the media, no knock on the captain's door with breathless urgency. Just a file slipped into the chain of evidence. Photos attached. Coordinates of the broken-down cabin logged with a quiet timestamp. The ledger, scanned, bagged, labeled. The photograph of James and Barron cleaned gently and enclosed in a plastic sleeve, not as evidence but as memory. He hadn't mentioned the bones or the blood. Some things didn't belong in paperwork. Some things belonged only to those who'd survived them. No one came to question him. No one asked why the case was reopened. There were whispers, of course, about the old trapper's route, about that hidden patch of forest too far from the main trails, about how a dog long declared dead had found his way back to the exact place where his handler had fallen. But no one spoke the questions aloud, perhaps because deep down, they didn't want the answers. By the week's end, a quiet crew from Boise arrived. No fanfare, just men in unmarked coats, heavy boots, and the weary pace of those who've seen too much. They hauled out the cages under tarps, hauled off boxes no one opened in daylight, hauled out the metal stake and chain like it was just scrap. The ground was salted. The structure collapsed. The trees, as always, said nothing. Back at the precinct, a memo went up on the bulletin board near the break room. Small white square, typed clean, no signature. Effective immediately, the unauthorized K9 training site in Payette National Forest has been dismantled and cleared. Internal review closed. Further inquiry unnecessary. That was all. 2 days later, an internal ceremony was arranged in the community hall. Not public, no cameras, just the department, a few of the older officers who'd known James Ellery, and a small handful of townspeople who still remembered his laugh. The podium was bare. There were no speeches scheduled, no honorary flags, just a folded uniform placed neatly on a stand, and a photograph of James framed in modest oak. And beside it, standing taller than anyone expected, was Barron. Someone had brushed his coat, though the scars still showed beneath. Around his neck, the old fabric collar Viola had given back, now stitched carefully with the patch of the Iron Hollow department. On his chest, clipped just above his shoulder, a pin, small, brass, and gleaming softly under the hall lights. Honorary K9 Service, Officer Barron. Caleb was there, but not at the podium. He stood off to the side, arms crossed, shoulders tight with a kind of tension that wasn't anger anymore, just the echo of something once broken now trying to hold shape. Someone called his name to speak. He didn't. Instead, he walked up to Barron. Kneeling beside him, Caleb placed one hand gently on the dog's head. No words, no orders, just a touch, firm and quiet. Barron closed his eyes, and the room, for a moment, felt like it had stopped breathing. There were no claps, no cheers, just the sound of someone clearing their throat in the back, and a chair creaking, and then stillness again. Later that night, when the hall had emptied and the chairs were stacked, Caleb found himself back at the precinct. He stood at the filing cabinet, staring at a row of names, closed cases, forgotten officers, dogs retired or buried. He slid open the drawer and, without a sound, inserted one more file. It had no conclusion, just a title, Ellery James Final. He left it there. Back at home, Barron was lying near the hearth again. This time he was asleep. Deeply, soundly, his legs twitching with something softer than fear. Caleb didn't wake him. He sat nearby, letting the fire cast long shadows across the wooden floor. It crackled, steady and low like breath. No one had been arrested. No one had confessed. But something had been undone, quietly and without ceremony. And sometimes, Caleb thought, that was enough. You didn't always need a gun to fix something broken. Sometimes you just needed to listen. Sometimes you just needed to come back. Barron had. And because he had, the truth had followed. The snow had long melted from Iron Hollow by the time Caleb returned to the cemetery. But the air still carried the hush of winter. Spring hadn't yet arrived in full bloom. Just hints of it, like a whisper through the trees. A single bird call here and there. A softer breeze over the hillside. The town below, with its one blinking traffic light and two-pump gas station, went about its slow rhythms, unaware of the quiet pilgrimage taking place above. Caleb parked the cruiser by the rusted gate, its hinges groaning as he pushed it open. He walked without speaking, a paper bag tucked under one arm, his other hand holding the leash loosely. Barron didn't pull, didn't lead, just walked beside him, his steps steady, his breath even. The scar on his neck, though faded now, still caught the light when he turned. He wore no badge today, no honorary patch, just the old collar Viola had returned, worn soft at the edges, but intact. They passed rows of simple stones, names etched in granite, years both long and painfully short. Caleb knew many of them. This town kept its history in stone and silence. When they reached James Ellery's grave, Barron stopped. He didn't look around. He didn't sniff. He didn't hesitate. He lay down slowly, folding his legs beneath him, and rested his head against the cold stone. There was no sound, no rustle of tail, no bark, just stillness, as if something inside him had finally come to rest. Caleb stood for a moment, then crouched beside him. He pulled a single white daisy from the paper bag and placed it at the base of the headstone. Not a rose, not a wreath, just a wildflower he'd picked on the roadside this morning, the kind James used to stop for, back when they were rookies, before they knew the weight the badge would carry. James had called them flowers that grew without permission. Caleb had never forgotten that. A gust of wind rolled over the hill. Barron blinked slowly. Caleb sat down beside him, knees bent, arms resting on them. He didn't say anything. Words had started all of this. Dispatch calls, official reports, radio silence. It felt right to let silence finish it. The horizon stretched wide before them, forest in the distance, smoke from someone's chimney in town, clouds thick but gentle, like brushed wool. Barron shifted only once, to lean a little closer, his flank touching Caleb's boot. He remembered the first time he saw Barron at the grave, gaunt, silent, with eyes full of something that had no name. Now that gaze was softer. The pain hadn't vanished, but it had found its place. It no longer ruled him. It lived beside him. They sat there until the sun lowered itself behind the ridge. No ceremony, no clock to punch, just two survivors and a stone. When Caleb rose, Barron didn't follow at first. He stayed. Caleb waited, didn't tug the leash, didn't call his name. After a few minutes, Barron pushed himself up slowly and stood. He looked one last time at the headstone, then turned and followed. At the gate, Caleb paused. He reached into his pocket and took out a small object, a brass dog tag, smooth and aged. He walked back quietly and hung it on the rusted fence near the corner, where the breeze could catch it. It read, Barron K9 found his way home. No one would notice it, probably, but that didn't matter. On the drive back into town, the radio stayed off. The road curved through the pines, golden light dripping between branches. Baron sat upright in the passenger seat, ears perked slightly, eyes watching the world as it passed. Not fearful, not searching, just present. They passed the Payette trailhead. Caleb glanced at it but didn't stop. Baron didn't react. That chapter, whatever was left of it, had closed. Back at the cabin, the fire had long gone cold. Caleb tossed in fresh logs, lit the kindling, and watched as the flames took shape. Baron padded over to his spot near the hearth and curled into himself. Not tightly, not defensively, just at ease. He let out a slow breath and tucked his nose beneath one paw. Caleb leaned against the doorframe, watching. The floor creaked beneath him, the kind of old sound that never startled, only reminded. He thought of James, of the silence after his death, of the 5 years Baron had vanished into the woods, of the old woman's trembling hand fastening the collar, of the chains and shadows buried in the forest, and of how a dog had returned, not to haunt, but to heal. He stepped outside for a moment. The sky above Iron Hollow was ink blue now, a few stars pushing through. Somewhere down the road, a porch light flickered on. A wind chime rang. Ordinary things. He looked up toward the ridgeline and thought, sometimes a soul doesn't come back the same. Sometimes it comes back quieter, tired, changed, but it comes back. And that's enough. He turned off the porch light, shut the door behind him, and let the warmth gather once more. Some stories don't end with justice served or medals awarded. Some end quietly, with a man sitting beside a grave and a dog who chose not to forget. Baron didn't return to prove anything. He returned because something inside him still remembered where home once was. And maybe that's all any of us are ever trying to do, to find our way back to the people who once looked at us with trust. Caleb never needed to ask why Baron waited all those years. Some answers are spoken in silence, in the way a dog rests his head on stone, or in the way a man places his hand gently on fur, making no promises, only presence. What we carry, our grief, our loyalty, our unfinished goodbyes, sometimes finds its place not in words, but in small, quiet acts of return. The world doesn't always reward loyalty, but sometimes, in the stillness between breath and memory, we're reminded that the truest bonds never really die. If this story touched something quiet in you, stay a little longer. Share with us in the comments. Have you ever been found by someone or something that never gave up on you? We'd love to hear your story. Sometimes telling it is how healing begins.